All right, we are live. After some technical difficulties, we have made it. So hello, everyone, and welcome to our live Q&A with a very special guest author, Samantha Shannon. So Samantha has written the Bone Season series and recently published The Priory of the Orange Tree, an epic fantasy standalone, or maybe not so much a standalone, but we'll dive into that later on in the Q&A. Also joining me today is Jean of Happy Indulgence, one of the Brisbane hosts for our book club, The Name of the Book.
Hi, everyone.
So yeah, we chose The Priory of the Orange Tree as our March book of the month, and we're absolutely thrilled to have author Samantha Shannon here live to answer some of the reader questions. So you guys submitted your questions, and we're going to be trying to get through some of those today. So yeah, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much, Samantha, for joining us, and congratulations on the recent release of this magnificent, oh my God, I can't talk, magnificent behemoth of a book. It is a large beauty.
Oh, thank you very much. It's really lovely to be here. And I'm so excited that you picked it for your book club. That's awesome.
Yeah. We had so much fun talking about it as well.
Yes, we absolutely loved it. And yeah, I just love the whole East meets West thing and all the dragons. And oh my gosh, I love the fantasy and the lore. But anyway, this isn't about me fangirling, although it's a little bit about me.
I'm happy with that.
It's a little bit about me fangirling, but we also wanted to thank you everyone for submitting their questions to us, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. We may not be getting to all of them depending on time, but yes, we will start our Q&A with some spoiler-free questions about Priory for anyone who hasn't read it yet, and if you haven't read it yet, you should. But then we'll jump onto some spoiler questions later on, so we'll make sure to share a warning about that and everything. So yes, just to get started, Sam, would you briefly tell us what The Priory of the Orange Tree is about?
Sure. It's a very difficult book to summarize, as you can probably tell by the length of it. But it is essentially about a world divided by a dark sea called the Abyss. And on one side of the Abyss is a young queen, Queen Severance, and she has been charged with having a daughter. If she doesn't have a daughter, the world is going to end, so no pressure. Well, that's what she's been told anyway. And on the other side of the sea, a young man stumbles out of the ocean onto a beach in the middle of the night and causes a whole heap of problems for a young dragon rider called Tane. There's a lot more to it than that. It's a kind of a book about religious conflict and lands that do not understand each other very well, and dragons and a whole lot more. And it's also a reimagining of the legend of George and the Dragon. And that is my terrible summary of The Priory of the Orange Tree.
It is such a hard book to describe because there's so many characters and so many plot lines going on. So yeah, I'm impressed that you've managed to summarize the book at all, to be quite honest.
Thank you. Yeah, it has a 20-page character guide or something. It is absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, it was actually very handy at the end how there was, the persons of the tale. So you talk about all, like, there's a list of all the characters and then also like a timeline and a glossary. So that was definitely super handy for this book as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually put it at the beginning this time as well. Like when you see the contents page, it does say glossary, because when people read my Bone Season series, they got to the end and they were like, oh no, there's a glossary. And I was struggling with all these Victorian slang words, and there is a glossary at the end. There's always a glossary at the end of a Samantha Shannon book. That's how you know.
All right, so next up, would you mind doing a little bit of a quick pronunciation guide for some of the main characters?
Sure. So arguably the protagonist is called Eid. Her full name is pronounced Adas. Then there is Lord Arteloth Beck. There is Tane Medici. There is who's the other one? Nicolas Roos. A name that a lot of people have struggled with is one of the secondary characters, and her name is Trude at Zadia. Which is kind of
wondering about that one.
Yeah, everyone struggles with that one. What else are some of the other difficult names to pronounce in the book? There's a lot of them, like there's quite simple ones, like some of them are just called like Margaret, for example. Yeah. But yeah, I'm trying to think of which other ones are very hard to pronounce.
I've got a couple of ones because we did have a few people asking for specific ones as well.
Sure.
Chassa.
Oh, Casa. It's Casa.
Yeah.
Yeah, Casa Ispad.
And Is it Fyrdell?
Fyrdell.
Fyrdell.
Yeah, it's just that little accent over the Y.
Yeah,
it's like Fyrdell. Yeah.
Wonderful. So thank you so much. That's definitely really, really helpful, obviously.
I'm glad. I will do a pronunciation guide at some point. There's just so many characters I'm going to do, all of the names come from different languages. So I'm planning to do like a big etymology document with pronunciations as well. So that would be, I'm working on it.
Oh my gosh, that sounds amazing.
I love language.
That definitely leads into one of our first questions is how did you manage to plan such a massive book like Priory with such a like complete detailed world, detailed magic system, backstory for so many characters and all in one book?
Well, I had to, when I was selling it to Bloomsbury, I had to write a synopsis for it, like a really detailed synopsis, because I was selling it not based on a full manuscript. So normally when you're a debut author, you have to present an entire manuscript to a publisher. When you have a bit of a reputation, you can sell it on a partial draft. So that's what I did. But the publishers usually asks you to say exactly what's going to happen so they can at least see where it's going. So I just wrote a really detailed plan of what I wanted to happen. And then I pretty much just stuck to it. And I was surprised by the fact that it just kept getting longer and longer and longer, because it was all of these storylines were weaving together. And I don't really like know exactly how I planned it. I just kind of wrote down what I wanted to happen and then followed it. And it's a bit easier than writing a series in that regard, because when you're writing a series, obviously you have to do a lot more planning about what's going to come back in the later books, and you have to plant seeds, and it requires a little bit more careful plotting. Whereas if you have a single standalone, everything is happening in one book. So it's not quite as difficult in that regard.
And I know it was a really long process for you as well. Obviously, it was a really, really long book that took you a while to write. Did you have any challenges that you recall writing it, or?
Yes, there was a point at which one of the narrators, Ede, has quite a lot more story than the others. And originally I planned for the middle section of the book, part 3, to only be told by Ede, because she had so much more story. So she got like a whole section to herself. But I felt that we missed the other characters during that time. So I had to do this kind of huge structural rearrangement of the book, where I was trying to pull Tane and Niclaise's stories out further so that they could appear in part 3. And that was quite difficult, because it just wasn't how I planned the book. Ede was always really the protagonist in my head. The title of the book is most closely tied into her story. So that was quite difficult, because I didn't want to add like unnecessary scenes with the two of them that were going to just add bulk to the book, but then they had to be there. So I just had to do this. That was probably the most challenging aspect of it. Structural edits are always really difficult, because with structural, it's like when you're actually changing the underlying shape of the story. So I always make the comparison that it's like pulling out, if you just pulled out someone's skeleton and then you're left with this huge bloody mess that you've left behind. That's it, because you're like trying to rearrange the whole structure. So you just get left with this total mess. And every time you make a big change like that, it has ripple effects throughout the whole story. So pulling a bit of Tane's story from somewhere else meant that I then had a problem, because I'd taken it from there. So then I had a gap in Tane's story, and it was just very different to how I'd planned it. Like when I wrote the synopsis, I always said, this is Ede's section by herself. And my editor was very strongly like, no, you need to bring the other characters in here. So that was probably the main challenge I faced. And there was also, when you're writing a standalone, it's quite difficult to not make things seem too easy. Because with the Bone Season series, I can introduce loads of setbacks, and every time a book ends, you know that there's still so many more challenges to come and so many more things that are going to happen to the characters. Whereas in a standalone like Priory, everything has to wrap up neatly by the end. So I can't introduce more conflicts at the end of the book. So that might give the impression that everything happens too easily or too neatly. So those were some of the challenges involved in writing it.
So yeah, you've mentioned a couple of the differences between writing a standalone and a series. I was just curious if there's any other differences or any other struggles you faced in that, and if you felt any pressure to either add in more details about the world, or you felt like you couldn't include some information that you wanted to. Like, did you feel restricted in that sense, or?
I did a little bit, yes, and it's because obviously the Bone Season series is 7 books long, so I've got so much space to play with the characters and to do whatever the heck I want, really. And I was determined to make Priory a standalone because I've already committed to a long series, and I didn't want to have another series going on the side because that was just an enormous commitment for me. And I was like, no, I can write a standalone. I can totally do it. And the first time I said to my agent, I'm going to write a standalone, he said, no, you're not. He was like, I know you, Mrs. 7-book series. Don't be ridiculous. You can't write a standalone. And I was like, I can write a standalone. Watch me. And then it was kind of too late by the time I realized, but there was just so much in the world of Priory that it could easily have been 2 books. And there was a point at which I was like, actually, there's so much I want to expand on in here, and I just can't, because the book was already really the maximum size it could be without a whole host of problems being introduced. So I couldn't expand on certain things. And there's like a character who comes in right near the end who I ended up finding completely fascinating, but I couldn't really expand on his role at all because there just wasn't room. And so and also the fact that at the beginning of the book I stick to quite a slow pace. It's all quite, political intrigue, slow burn romance, and then at the end I'm suddenly having to like rush through because I'm just running out of space. And that's fine, because I think it works with the nature of the story, because it's a story about chaos and about destruction. So I quite like that the pace becomes really hectic near the end, but it does add a slight sense of unevenness to it. So I did feel quite restrained, because I am a person with a really big imagination. I do big world building, like big complex plots, but loads of history. And actually it's funny saying that an 830-page book, I needed more room, but I really did. So yeah, that was quite challenging, and I would now like to write more books within the world of Priory. But yeah, it was certainly a struggle trying to fit one neat kind of beautiful quest narrative into this space without it feeling like, oh, everything's just going too easily, and having the characters just feel like moving parts in a very easy story. So yeah, it was pretty challenging.
Yeah, that was one of the things that myself and like a lot of other people from the book club also loved, was the complex world building and all the histories. And one of our other hosts, one of the Sydney hosts, said that she would love to just read an encyclopedia or world history book about everything in the Priory world.
I would love to write one. I would love that.
Yes, I'm totally down for that 20-page character guide, by the way.
Yes, no, I loved writing the character guide, and it's spoiler free, so you can look at it anytime in the book. I'm not going to say this is a character that dies. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, that sounds amazing. And speaking of characters, we've got a question here that is, which character do you emphasize with the most in the story? I know there's a lot of them.
Yeah, I think that I am most like the character of Tanny. She has anxiety. I have anxiety. She's a workaholic. I am also a workaholic. And I kind of expressed my own thoughts about my relationship with my work and my ambition, and the fact that Tanny has this great fear that if she doesn't practice all the time, if she doesn't give every single part of herself to her work and her dream, then she will fail, and that she's somehow not worthy of it. And when I became an author, it gave me anxiety, because I was like, this is something that so many people want and that I'm so lucky to have, and now I have to be worthy of it. And that is basically what Tanny goes through, except that she's a dragon rider, not an author. So she and I are, well, I say we're not closest in age, actually. I'm closest to Ede in age, but she's near enough my age that it sort of felt like she could be part of my journey. Strangely though, I also really empathize with Nicholas, which I did not expect, because he is a 64-year-old man. And I was like, I clearly have a secret 64-year-old gay alchemist within me. And I'm expressing him into the world now, because I just, he's a character, he's very morally complicated. And I feel that a lot, I kind of peek at the reactions to Priory sometimes out of sheer curiosity. And a lot of people don't like Nicholas, and I expected that. I expected him to be very much a Marmite character, or a Vegemite character, as you guys are saying. A Vegemite character. But I expected him to be a character who was kind of disliked by some people, because he's selfish, you know, he's driven by his own desires. He will put other people in danger because of those desires. But he's actually gone through so much, and it's not an excuse for his behavior, but it's certainly, I could trace why he became the way he did, because, you know, he went through this awful kind of abusive childhood at the hands of his father and then later his mother, and then he fell in love with this man and had this amazing relationship with him, but then the man was, you know, wrenched away from him, and his whole dream, that everything he'd ever worked for, had been torn away. And then on top of that, he gets banished to the end of the world, and he's stuck and he's a man of, you know, great intellectual capacity, who's stuck on this tiny little island. He's seeing this incredible country that he can't access, he can only look at it, and it's enormously frustrating. So I can empathize, well, not empathize because I haven't gone through it, but I can sympathize with that. So he was a character that I loved writing, and I did feel very emotionally connected to. It was surprising, but very much so.
Yeah.
I actually quite liked his character, because he was just, as you said, he's a 64-year-old man, and his journey's at a different point to everyone else. And it was really interesting just seeing how that all played out as well. So yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm glad that you're a member of the Nicolaes fan club. We are small but mighty.
Fallen into a group. So yeah, you mentioned that Nicolaes is one of your favorite characters to write. Were there any other characters that you particularly enjoyed writing about, not just empathizing or sympathizing with them, but were there any that were more fun or intriguing?
Definitely Ede. Like I said, she's essentially the protagonist of the story, and I loved writing her because I loved writing the court setting, and I realized I love courtly intrigue. I love all of the posturing and the backstabbing and the rumors and the gossip. It's like warfare without any weapons, and it was just, and I also just love, because the palaces of Innis are so incredibly beautiful, and the Innish puts so much weight on beauty. It was great fun being able to write a setting like that. And I just loved sinking into court life. I always looked forward so much to Ede's scenes. And of course, her relationship with Sabran was such a joy to write. So I was always just desperate to get back to Ede. But I also loved writing all of them in various ways. I loved writing Tane, because again, she's in a very, very beautiful setting, this like wonderful island where things are bioluminescent and there are dragons. And again, I loved Tane's journey, and yeah, all of them, but I think Ede is probably the one that I was like, oh my God, I really want to get back to Ede now. And also she, like I said, she's most closely tied into the story of the Priory itself. And that was a really lovely section to write about the actual Priory of the Orange Tree.
I actually loved hearing about Sabran. Sorry, is it Sabran?
It's Sabran,
yeah, Sabran through Ede's point of view and everything. And it was really interesting how we never really got to hear her point of view, but instead we knew her through other characters. What made you decide not to write Sabran's point of view?
Do you know, that's really interesting, because I never considered writing from Sabran's point of view once. And I guess I'm used to creating complex characters through another character, because when obviously my bonus season series is totally told in first person by only one character. And there is a kind of a fun challenge in that. Like, how do you make people like these characters, sympathize with these characters, understand these characters when you're never in their heads once? So I was used to that, and I hope I do it with some success in the bonus season. But yeah, Sabran, I was like, I liked the challenge of learning about Sabran through Ede, who is from such a different kind of cultural background, and she's been told that Sabran could essentially be a blasphemer. Their religions are kind of incompatible with one another, and I thought it would be more interesting to learn about this character through Ede and have her slowly lower her defenses and Ede just begin to see the person that she is underneath. And that wouldn't have been so compelling if we were in Sabran's head, because then we'd already know the person Sabran is underneath. But yeah, I never really considered it. And now I think if I were to write a sequel to Priory, I might consider writing from Sabran's perspective, because she is such an interesting character for me. And she's fundamentally good, but then she's incredibly arrogant and imperious because of how she's been raised. Another reason I didn't write her perspective was because Ede is with her most of the time. And I think that it would have been a bit unnecessary for me to have two characters who in such incredibly close quarters, because Edith's in such an intimate position with Severance. She's a very close lady in waiting who's essentially seeing everything that Severance is seeing. She's with Severance for meetings. She's literally sleeping in the same bed as Severance. So having a whole separate perspective, I think, would have felt a little bit like, what's the point of this? I would have needed a really strong justification for that. So I think unless they were in separate countries and Severance's perspective would bring something very particular to the story, I just didn't think it was necessary in the end.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I really liked getting to know Severance through the point of view of Eve, because as you said, she's in a really intimate position with her. So it was really cool. Like, she's a bit more of a mysterious character at the start of it, and then you get to know her more and unravel her layers. And she was such an interesting character to get to know from an outside perspective. So I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the other questions we received is, what kind of research did you have to do for this project?
A lot. So there were two main aspects to the research. So the first one was the mythological aspect. And I set out specifically to write a feminist reimagining of the legend of George and the Dragon. And I first encountered that legend when I was, a really little girl at school, because I went to a Christian school. They were all about George and the Dragon and his kind of Christian symbolism as this slayer of evil. But it always used to really get on my nerves that the princess in the story just stands there looking holy and does absolutely nothing. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna reimagine this story. But to reimagine it, I had to research it. And there are lots of different versions of the legend. So I looked right back to the very earliest version. And I found out that when St. George saves the people from this dragon, and the famous story about the people created this lottery of lives and they're sacrificing their children to the dragon before St. George comes. And I found out that when, in the first version of the story, St. George goes to this place, he sees that the dragon is eating all these children. And he says, yeah, sure, I'll slay the dragon for you, no problem. But you have to convert to Christianity first. And I was like, so if they don't convert to Christianity, you're just going to let the dragon keep eating their children? That doesn't seem very Christian.
No. Wow.
So I took issue with that. And then I kept looking into different versions of the story. And I found this other one, which was from the 16th century, late 16th century. And it had this rather fascinating addition where when George fights the dragon, he rolls underneath an orange tree, an enchanted orange tree, and it protects him from the dragon's fire. And it's an incredibly problematic story. Again, George, the princess immediately falls in love with him, and then she immediately, oh, don't worry about all of my religion and my right to the throne of Egypt. I'll give up everything as long as I can follow you like a pilgrim. So I decided to take various elements from these stories and to reimagine them from a more modern and feminist perspective. So the orange tree, for example, I take that away from George because George is awful, and I give it to a bunch of cool dragon slaying women. And that's the kind of thing I did. Yeah. So there was that aspect to it. And then there was also the historical aspect. So when I first conceived of Priory, I had this idea that I was going to tell the story about dragons, but it kind of lacked, I couldn't quite picture it for some reason. And I didn't have a very clear idea of what the world was going to look like. And then one day, my little brother came into my office and asked for help with his homework on the Spanish Armada. And I was like, oh my God, the Spanish Armada, like the Elizabethan era. When do you ever see a fantasy novel where everyone's dressed in like Elizabethan clothes? Because it's normally really medieval, and that's the general touchstone. So I got really excited about this, and I thought, okay, why don't we do a fantasy world that's based on the politics of the 16th and 17th centuries? But then I also wanted to do this thing where I had a dragon system that involved both the more Eastern style of dragon, where it's more to do with air and water, and also integrated the traditional Western view of dragons, which is fire and evil and sort of satanic evil. So I thought, okay, I will do a big fantasy world, and I'm going to have to research multiple countries in the 16th and 17th century. So that's what I did. So there was a lot of research involved in that, because you can't create a fantasy version of a country until you know the country's history relatively well. So yeah, there was a lot of research to do with that.
And it definitely paid off, because I love just how you could really see, like, even just looking at the map, you can see the story come to life and how everything's based off, the different like religious aspects based off the nameless one and the war. So yeah, it really paid off.
I'm really glad.
Yeah, I just chiming in to say I really loved how like all the the religions were based off kind of the same thing, but seeing how vastly different everything is interpreted was really interesting.
Yeah, I'm interested in the idea of kind of a religion that was based on actual events, but the idea of what exactly happened during those events had become massively muddled over the 1,000-year gap between the event and the now. And I mean, obviously some of the religions in the book are entirely separate, like the religion of the Dawn Singer, for example, is not based on the confrontation with the Nameless One. But I just found that fascinating that you have these characters who all essentially believe in the same story and the same characters, but in different versions. And I like the idea that George, kind of the George figure, Galleon, would have basically just stolen credit from the princess and created this whole country. And poor old Sabran like believes in this so utterly that she walks out in front of a dragon thinking that the saint is going to extend his... I loved writing that scene. She's so hilariously like, she's like, because the dragon is like, yeah, so you're not scared I'm going to burn you to death. She's like, no, the saint will protect me. And then Ede's like, oh, for God's sake, save this moron. She goes out to die. So yeah, that was just great fun. And it allowed for a lot of interesting relationships. Like the relationship between Loth and Sabran is so powerful because Loth believes in Sabran's divinity, but then his views get challenged. Ede obviously likes Sabran as a person, but is thinking, oh no, her religion is so incompatible with mine, and she's the seed of Galleon the Deceiver. So it just had a lot of interesting potential for, you know, religious differences and divisions.
Oh, yes, sorry. I was really absorbed in that. Yeah, no, that was really fascinating. And yeah. All right, so who's your biggest literary influence, Sam?
Strangely, The Prior of the Orange Tree actually grew out of a lack of literary influences when I was younger. So with The Bone Season, I have quite clear literary influences like Anthony Burgess and Margaret Atwood. It was very specifically grew out of dystopian fiction I had read in the past. Whereas with Priory, I can trace it right back to when I was 10 years old and The Fellowship of the Ring came out at the cinema. And I went to see it, and I had never been more excited in my life before I saw the character of Arwen. And I had never seen a woman in fantasy like Arwen before. I mean, I've seen women in fantasy, but they were always on the sidelines. They were always serving a male story whenever I saw films or anything like that. Or they were just super minor, basically. So when I saw Arwen and she fights the Nazgul by herself, and she's like, come and claim him. I was like, oh my God, this is the coolest person I've ever seen in my life. And obviously there's that rule, the book is always better, right? So I ran straight out to a bookshop, right straight from the cinema, and bought a copy of Lord of the Rings. And I went through it and I was looking at that scene with Arwen. And of course, that scene does not feature Arwen in the actual book. It's a different elf, a male elf. And it was an addition by Peter Jackson to make the Lord of the Rings less aggressively male. So I read it and it actually broke my heart because I had pinned so much hope on having, I thought that there was going to be so much more about Arwen in the books because the book usually expands on the film. And it just broke my heart that she was such a side character. So for many years, I didn't read epic fantasy. I didn't really read fantasy at all because I was like, what's the point? You know, I'm always going to be a side player in this. So I didn't read a lot of books that other female fantasy authors have read. So I didn't find Tamora Pierce or Anne McCaffrey or any of those big kind of female epic writers or like, you know, any of those. So weirdly, I didn't get back into fantasy until I read Sabriel by Garth Nix. And my friend in sort of, you know, I adore Garth Nix, just what a guy. I read that and it got me back into it because again, it was a woman at the forefront. You know, the book literally had her name as the title, and that got me back into it. But before that, I just have this weird gap. So when people say, "What are your influences?" I'm always like, none really. So yeah, this was me writing the book that my 10-year-old self wanted to read at that time, and me filling in the gap that I had, basically. So it's a story that I deliberately use high fantasy tropes like the magic sword and, you know, the sort of the magical objects and stuff. And I'm perfectly aware that this has all been done in the past, but the way I see it, a trope does not become something that we shouldn't do anymore until everyone has had a shot at it. It's like, you know, how everyone said like, oh, paranormal romance is all done, but all of the heroines in paranormal romance, so many of them were just white women, and it's not fair to say that until everybody's had a shot at it. So I don't want to hear, oh, we can't do the chosen one or the magic sword, etc., until I see everyone having had a shot at that trope. So that was what I was trying to do. I was trying to write a story that was, it centered women. It was the fantasy novel I wanted to read, but it centered a range of women who were driving the action.
And so that makes me so happy, because the whole, I loved how it was a female-led fantasy story with like a really great world and everything, and it included a lot of modern-day issues, but set in a fantasy setting, and it's, that's what I really loved about it.
Yeah, I'm really glad. And it's also like, I wanted to set it in a world where the world wasn't misogynistic either, and it wasn't racist, it wasn't homophobic, because I think it's actually become an expectation of fantasy now that it has to be set in these, because fantasy draws so heavily from history. People seem to assume that all fantasy worlds are going to be sexist because it's historically accurate, right? And this happens with Game of Thrones. You know, we see there's dragons and ice zombies, but if a woman is powerful, we're very historically inaccurate now. And the way I see it, we don't have to draw certain elements of history into fantasy at all. We can choose which elements of history to take across. So I was like, you know what, I'm going to find other ways for women to face conflict rather than being under constant threat because of their gender. So that was another thing I tried to do with the story.
Yeah, it was honestly just so satisfying as a reader to read an epic fantasy with so many women at the forefront and seeing so many different types of relationships between women, but also the relationship, like platonic relationships between men. Like, I loved Artelot's friendships with Sabrin and Eid. Like, those were some relationships. It was so heartwarming.
Yeah, well, again, like, there's this expectation that every sort of friendship has to turn into a romance, right? And I wanted to, I mean, obviously Loth, bless his soul, is under suspicion of being too close to Sabran. But the funny thing is that he's never had that kind of relationship with Sabran. They're just childhood friends who've been incredibly close the whole time. So yeah, again, I just thought, well, why not just have a friendship where it doesn't turn into a romance all the time? And yeah, maybe have some characters who aren't in romance at all. And because that's another thing that kind of frustrates me, where all of the characters somehow end up paired up, and I'm like, God, is it the worst thing in the world? So yeah, I just wanted to kind of buck the trend a little bit and just do a few things like that.
And it's funny because the tables are kind of turned with Loth as well, because he's the one that's exiled, whereas obviously in history it's always the women who kind of got too close and get the whole witches thing.
Yeah, he's very slightly inspired by Robert Dudley, who was the childhood friend of Elizabeth I. And although he wasn't exiled, there was a lot of suspicion that Dudley had slept with Elizabeth and that they'd had this secret child together and all this kind of thing. So that was where I got the idea from. I do suspect that Elizabeth and Dudley were maybe having a bit of a thing. I don't know if they were like actually like together, but I think they definitely were at least slightly in love with each other. But I thought, okay, what if I take the Dudley type of character but then have it so there genuinely is nothing between them, and he ends up paying the price for that. So yeah, that was one of the historical inspirations.
Really interesting. So the last question before we dive into our spoiler section, so after this question, we will be asking some more detail-oriented questions about things that happen later on in the book. This question was, how did you come up with the names for the dragons?
Well, all of the names in the Priory of the Orange Tree, the vast majority of them come from old or archaic forms of existing languages or completely dead languages. So some of them come from Gothic and Sumerian. Some of them come from Old Chinese, Proto-Japanese, Old English, Old Norse, languages that exist but are no longer used commonly. And there are some exceptions, like there are some modern words used, but mostly they are from old forms. So the dragon names are also from that. So Firadel comes from Old English, for example. Naima Thun is a mix of Proto-Mongolian and Old Chinese, because the Lacustrine names I generally use Old Chinese for, but then Naima Thun is a bit of a wanderer, so she has this different element to her name. So yeah, that's where all of them come from. Most of them do have some kind of significant meaning. So the character of Valesa, who's one of the High Western dragons, her name is from Old Norse, and it kind of refers to a hawk or an eagle that leaves embers and dead bodies in its wake, which I enjoyed constructing the names.
Yeah.
I have a lot of, I did Old English as part of my degree at university, and I've been fascinated by language development ever since. So I loved going through the old forms of the languages and piecing names together from that. It was great fun.
All right, so now we're going to dive into the spoilers section. So if you guys don't mind hearing about the deaths and the spoilers and what happens in the book, definitely click off. But, all right, so being an epic fantasy and a standalone, obviously, unfortunately, some characters have to die. So which character did you most regret having to kill?
Definitely Kit. I felt so bad. I really felt bad. Like in the original draft, he actually came back, and my editor was like, "You can't keep bringing them back." She was like, "There has to be some sense of jeopardy here." I was like, "But I love him. He did nothing wrong. He's just a poet living his best life." And he's such a good friend to Loss. You know, he follows him so loyally, even though he doesn't know what situation he's going into. But he's like, "Loss, my best friend. I'll follow him to the ends of the earth." And I did feel really bad about that, especially because he goes in quite a nasty way. Yeah, I think he's probably the one I regret the most. There was a character who my editor wanted to die, but who didn't die, and we had it was a disagreement, as you say. So there was a disagreement about whether Nicolaes would die or not. And I felt it was too obvious for Nicolaes to die, because he's this morally grey character and he's done things wrong. And to me, it just seemed like too much of an obvious redemption arc for him to die, because it's kind of saying, like, if you do anything wrong, then you just have to die. And that is the only option we have here.
Yeah.
And I just didn't want that. So I kept Nicolaes alive, because he's my man and I'll protect him. Yeah, so I definitely regret killing Kit, and I do not regret not killing Nicolaes.
Oh, Kit was like, because he dies relatively early on, but like he's just so well written and such a wholesome character that I fell in love with him from the start. So I was devastated.
Yeah, I'm sorry. He's so, like, again, there's more to him than you get to see. Like, he kind of implies he has this very poor relationship with his father, Lord Honeybrook, and he did have a bit of a difficult time, because his father always thought that his poetry was just rubbish, and he always had a go at Kit's mother for giving him such a terrible kind of pointless heir who just flops around court writing poetry. And Kit's such a good person, and yeah, he is a little bit, he enjoys the finer things in life, and he's a joker and he doesn't take things very seriously, but he's still such a good person, and his father just never saw that about him, and it's kind of a sad thing.
Yeah. Oh, it was also very sad because he was writing love letters. I can't remember who it was.
To Kate. It was Severance Lady in Waiting.
Yeah.
Kate. Yeah.
And then a little while afterwards, she mentions that she stopped receiving the love letters, and it was very I know, I was like, oh, I've got to just... She's like, oh no, the love letters have stopped coming, and the reader knows, but they don't know. She didn't even know. Oh.
Yeah, that was upsetting.
So another question we got, was there a point in the creation of Priory that you cried? And if so, what part? And this, the person who asked this as well says, love your books, I've read them all.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, the parts where I cried, I didn't cry very often, but it was always Nicolaes that made me cry every single time. Like when he returns to Mentenden and he sees Janart's his tomb, and he sort of talks to it, and I was so upset. Like, it was just, I really did cry that, because he just kind of says, you know, you were my midnight sun, the light that I followed, and I will live because I think that's what you would have wanted. And it's Nicolae's kind of finally not letting go of Janart, but he's suffered so heavily with grief throughout the book, and this is the first step to his being able to let go of that a little bit and move on with his life. And that really just did upset me. And Nicolae has just had such a sad life. Like, it's just so sad. And I was like, this man is breaking my heart, because I've put him through so much. And that's another reason I couldn't kill him, because it just felt like the cherry on the cake, you know, like, I'll just give you the worst life ever, and then I'm just going to kill you instead. I was like, I can't do it to him. It's just cruel. So yeah, that was that he did make me cry a couple of times. And there was a few parts with Sabran and Eid where I was kind of getting a little bit teary, because I was just like, I love them so much and they love each other so much, and this is just so emotional. But yeah, it was mostly Nicolae's and his flashbacks to Janart, often kind of, because it is just so sad. He waited 30 years. Like, that's a really long time to wait for this dream of going to the Milk Lagoon, and then it's just gone. And that was really, really sad.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I think I cried a bit when Nicholas was looking for True. Is it True?
Oh no, I forgot about that.
Gosh.
Oh my goodness.
That broke my heart. Oh my gosh.
He's like, I can be a better man. I'm going to be a great grandpa to Trude. And you're like, oh no, wait. And he doesn't know. He doesn't know that she's dead, and her head is rotting on the gate. Like, it's just, I was like, oh God, this is another reason that it was just awful. Like, on top of that, and he's like the one person that still cares about me, still writes me letters, and she's dead. And it's like, oh. So that was
yes, I'm very glad you didn't kill him on top of all of that.
It just would have felt vindictive. It was like just unnecessary. Like, the guy suffered enough, leave him alone.
Oh gosh. Speaking of someone who has suffered, can you explain what happened with Tane at the end of the book? Obviously, you know, she wakes up with her side damp with blood, and I heard that maybe she might get a sequel. We don't know.
Certainly the ending for Tane is an opening for a sequel. There is a very specific reason that she wakes up with her side damp with blood, and that she's got this butterfly in her hand. She's not dead. I should clarify this. A few people have messaged me to say, oh my God, did you kill Tane at the end? That was so cruel. And me, like, why did she die? I was like, no, she's not dead. She fell asleep by the mulberry tree, and she woke up, and her side where the jewel was is bleeding again, and she has this butterfly, and we know that butterflies are the messengers from the celestial plane. So yeah, I can't explain why she wakes up like that, but there is a specific reason why she does.
Interesting. Well, one of the most asked questions we received was about whether there were any plans to write a sequel or a follow-up book. I believe you potentially mentioned writing like not like a direct sequel, but a companion story or anything. And there was a few questions about a secret Priory project.
Yes, I am working on a secret Priory project, which I cannot specifically talk about because I haven't officially sold it yet. I have got the go-ahead to write it. We're still just talking about it with Bloomsbury. But yes, I'm working on that now. If I was to write, I'd ideally like to write 2 prequels and a sequel. That would be my ideal Priory kind of arc. But I try to make all of them standalone. So I think with the Bone Season series, it's really difficult to pick up one of the books if you haven't read the other books, because you'll be like, what is going on? This is insane. But I want, with the Priory books, I'd like you to be able to read them all separately without having to commit to the whole series. So that's the idea. So standalone prequels and a sequel, hopefully, if I can.
Oh, that would be amazing, because as we mentioned before, there's just so much of the world, so much of the history that we didn't like, that you didn't have the time or the space to explore. So it'd be really cool to get more of that.
Yeah, the prequels, I mean, there is so much history. There's 1,000 years of history. So that's, yeah, I would really like to explore that.
Ooh, that's really exciting. All right. So, okay. Can we ask, do Sabrin and Eid end up together in the happy place?
Or is
I can't possibly tell you that. I can't.
Sequel, I guess.
Yeah, if I wrote a sequel, we would be hearing from Eid and Sabran again. So yeah, okay. I'll be mysterious about that.
Okay. That's fair enough. So I think we're going to wrap up shortly, but we do have a bit of a lightning round of this or that questions.
Yeah.
So All right, let's get started. So plotting or pantsing?
I'm going to be an asshole and say a mix of both because they're both so necessary. You know, pantsing to help create natural characters and plotting to help actually hold it together. So a little bit of both.
Do you edit as you go, or do you fly through the first draft and then fix everything later?
I used to fly through the first draft, and then I wrote a very bad first draft for The Songrising, my third bonus season book, and now I edit as I go along because I'm absolutely petrified of handing in a first draft that's not absolutely beautiful. So edit as I go along. Do
you write at day or night?
No, generally night. I mean, again, a bit of both because it is my full-time job, so I do write in the day, but I sort of, my creative instincts wake up more at night.
Mm. Do you write in any public places or just kind of at home?
Sometimes public places. I do like going to the cafe. I like working at the British Library. So I like to kind of vary where I work.
Do you write to music or complete silence?
Depends on the stage I'm at. So drafting, I normally have to have silence, but if I'm editing, I listen to music.
And do you type everything or do you handwrite anything, whether that's like the actual draft or planning stages or anything like that?
100% type. I think it's lovely that people use pens, but I mean, I haven't really written since I did my exams at university, so my hand can barely form letters anymore.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee. I'm going to buck the British trend. I definitely prefer coffee.
Water or fire?
Oh, fire. Yeah.
Dragons or serpents?
Dragons, 100%. I'm going to have to plug my laptop in really quickly.
Okay. That's all right. We're almost at the end here. But east or west?
I think east in the world of Priory. Yeah.
That was definitely one of the places I was really intrigued to learn more about.
Yeah, I would love to explore that more in a prequel, because I think we did spend so much time in the West and the South, because obviously Lost is in the South quite a lot as well. But I loved writing about the East, and it was really fascinating using certain aspects of history, like the Sakoku era of Japan. That was a really absolutely fascinating period of history, and I would definitely like to explore more of that side of the world in the prequels.
Awesome. Well, that pretty much wraps up our Q&A. So Samantha, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today and giving a bit of more of an insight into the world of the Priory and your writing process.
Thank you very much for having me. And again, thank you so much for choosing it for your book club. It's always so lovely to know that people are discussing it. And it's still so amazing to me that people are discussing my books like so far away as Australia. It's amazing.
Yes, thank you for writing an awesome feminist dragon-led fantasy.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for reading it.
It was a delight to read.
We can't wait to see what's next.
Yes, absolutely.
Me neither. I'm working on it in the background.
And also a huge thank you to everyone who watched today and all of your lovely comments, and also for those of you who submitted questions as well. Yeah, so thank you guys so much for watching. And I guess we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.